and welcome to our second keynote. We are truly spoiled with labor historians here at this conference, and I'm not just being polite, this is true. And today we have with us Dorothy Sue Cobble, who will be giving a talk under the title New Movements, New Paradigms, Reimagining Labor History for Our Future. Dorothy Sue comes from the United States, but she has connections with Nordic labor history because she is currently holding the Kirsten Hesselgrant Professorship at Stockholm University, awarded to her by the Swedish Research Council. But her main job, of course, is at Rutgers University, where she holds a joint appointment in the Department of Labor Studies and Employment Relations and the Department of History. She specializes, and you know this, but I'm going to say it anyway, in the study of work, social movements, and social policy in the United States and globally. And I'm also sure that you know about her work, but I'll mention a few of her books. In 2014, she published, together with Linda Gordon and Astrid Henry, a book called Feminism Unfinished, a short, surprising history of American women's movements, where they rewrite the history of the American women's movements, including, for example, the labor perspective. In 2007, she edited The Sex of Class, Women Transforming American Labor. And in 2004, she published the critically acclaimed and award-winning The Other Women's Movement, Workplace Justice and Social Rights in Modern America, where she writes about the forgotten feminism of labor women. Dorothy Sue Cobble is editor of ILWICH, International Labor and Working Class History, published by the Cambridge University Press. And at the moment, she is working on global workers' movements, women's international reform networks, and America's progressive political traditions from World War I to the present, as well as a biography of consumer labor and women's rights activist Esther Peterson. Please give a warm welcome to Dorothy Sue Cobble.
Thank you, Ragnar. And I want to thank the conference organizers for inviting me to speak and for bringing us all together in Iceland. I guess I didn't think my morning keynote would be given in what seems like midnight, but I appreciate your all being here. I'm very honored and pleased to be here. In October, I was talking to Silke about the upcoming conference. And at that point, we were worrying about snowstorms, and Silke was checking on the volcano and its possible eruption every once in a while. But little did we anticipate how much more we would have to worry about once November actually rolled around and we woke up to the news of the Trump election in the US. So you can imagine, I'm very happy to be in Iceland. I'm also, I really welcome this opportunity to think together with you all here about the time in which we live. It's a very sobering, volatile, and challenging moment. And I look forward to thinking with you about how we can best respond and how we can make a positive difference. So my talk here is going to be very political. As you know, the last Nordic Labor History Conference was some 12 years ago in 2004. And the organizers of this conference said in their call, it's time to pick up where we left off, they said, and get things rolling. And it seems to me they really have gotten things rolling. So I just want to give them a round of applause for bringing us here. Thank you very much. And what it seems to me that it's up to us to keep things rolling, what they've begun. And my sense from yesterday is that we are doing just that. It was a very stimulating, thought-provoking day, and I want to thank all of you for that. And I'm looking forward to our conversation after my talk and then for the rest of the day and the rest of the conference. Some months ago, when I began to think about what I was going to say this morning, I realized that I was in a bit of a pickle. I don't know if you know that phrase, but it just means that I thought I had a problem. I was planning on talking about reimagining labor history to folks who really are already doing that. Or put another way, I was going to fly off to Iceland to be with scholars, teachers, activists, and archivists who had already begun to cut through the ice of the old frozen labor history and had broken free of many of its constraints. So I thought, what possibly could I add? Then I remembered the wisdom of one of my most important teachers, actually a man I spent only one afternoon with, and it was by mistake. I was visiting my grandmother in her farm in East Tennessee, which is in America's hillbilly country. And that afternoon, it was some 25 years ago, I ended up talking to one of her neighbors. This neighbor turned out to be the great labor educator and philosopher Myles Horton. I don't know if you know Myles Horton. He founded Tennessee's Highlander Folk School. It was modeled on the Danish folk schools he visited in Denmark in the early 30s. And he spent his life talking to poor and disenfranchised people, the leaders of the CIO, the leaders of the civil rights movement in the US, about valuing what they knew, about recognizing the truths of their experience, and about using those truths to make the world a better place for all of us. So I settled into one of his rocking chairs on the porch, and we looked out over the green expanses of Tennessee's Smoky Mountains. Then he offered me some advice. And it was an advice I had countered again when I read his memoir, The Long Haul. What he said was comforting and inspiring to me then, and it remains so now. Dorothy Sue, he said, just remember that everyone has a piece of the puzzle. We'll never understand the whole world, the whole pie, or see the world for what it is until everyone has contributed their piece. So it's really in that spirit and in memory of Myles Horton that I offer you my piece of the puzzle. In the first part of my talk, what I want to focus on is how much labor history has changed in the last few years and the positive directions I see in the field. And here I'm going to be echoing some of what Marcel so eloquently talked to us about yesterday. Then in the second part of the talk, I want to suggest some promising paths for labor history's future. And I offer these because I believe that we care about getting the history right, but also that we care about changing our world for the better. So let me start with how I see labor history changing. As this conference makes clear, and as Marcel reinforced for us yesterday, labor history has broadened in the last decade. I think history is inevitably a dialogue between the present and the past, and as today's work world and today's labor movements have broadened, so too has the field of labor history. Labor history is no longer just about waged work or industrial jobs or standard employment or so-called free labor. It is about all kinds of work, all kinds of workers, and all kinds of worker movements. We're writing the history of sex workers, domestic workers, servants, slaves, and many others once invisible and marginalized. We are analyzing new forms of what I call worker mutualism, associations of the self-employed, worker cooperatives among vendors and small producers, alliances and networks of taxi drivers, fashion models, retail workers, and online freelancers and crowd workers. We're writing about new forms of worker protest and the upsurge of political unionism. In the US, we see this political upsurge in the rise of wage justice movements like Fight for 15 and the huge nationwide movement for a minimum living wage for all jobs. But we can see this phenomena globally as well, with many other examples worldwide of workers organizing politically to gain living wages, end coerced labor, and claim their civil and human rights for freedom of speech, freedom of movement, and freedom of association. Yet we're not just writing about work or worker movements, old or new. We are writing about the world in which workers lived and the wide range of activities, cultural, social, and intellectual, in which they engaged. So if you look at the sessions here at the conference, there are sessions on migration, on workers as writers, on anti-fascist politics and contentious politics, on social welfare, on everyday life strategies, on education, and more. It is, again, a history of the world of the worker, of the non-elites, and often told from their bottom-up perspectives. And we think globally, too. We've moved beyond the nation state, and our histories are enriched by comparative analysis, network theory, and attention to transnational circuits, entanglements, and exchange. We are learning from labor historians outside the West and incorporating their categories and insights into our narratives. But labor history is not just broadening, it's also growing. We can see this upward thrust in the global South, in India, Brazil, and elsewhere, but we can see this uptick as well in the older industrial countries. In the last decade, for example, in the US, the Labor and Working Class History Association has actually become one of the largest professional history associations, with its own journal, multiple prizes, and large annual conferences. And as you know, in Europe, there are energetic new national labor history networks, and as of 2013, the new European Labor History Network. Some of this growth actually happened without labor history or labor historians having to change at all. The subjects we study became fashionable, and scholarship moved in our direction. Younger scholars rediscovered methods and questions central to our field. And here I'm thinking about the flourishing new research on histories of capitalism, or the explosion of writing on unfree and coerced labor, or the new institute centers and foundation initiatives on inequalities, on migration, on inclusive economies, on the future of work. True, scholars engaged with such questions may not call themselves labor historians, but certainly what they do overlaps or should overlap with the broadened field of labor history that is emerging. I find all these trends exciting. We are truly on a roll. And I think there are parallels between what is happening inside the academy and what is happening outside. Just as labor history is reviving, so too is the labor movement. Indeed, its creativity and growth, I believe, has been fundamental to our own. Despite what many say, and this is a very widespread and deeply embedded narrative, the labor movement is not in precipitous decline. The narrative is that it is. I'm going to contest that. I see the labor movement at a moment of reconfiguration and even recovery. Marcel pushed back yesterday against what he called the crisis of labor history. And what I want to do is push back a bit against the crisis and decline of labor movements. Why do I think that? Two reasons. First, as I mentioned earlier, there's a vibrant new non-traditional labor movement that is emerging. Yet this movement rarely appears in official statistics or even in the imaginations of those writing and talking about trade unions or organized labor. But that situation needs to change. If we're to fully capture the size and vitality of today's labor movement, we will need to include both the new and the old forms of worker mutualism. We'll need to include these labor movements both in our data and in our narratives. The rise and fall of collective bargaining should not be confused with the rise and fall of labor movements as a whole. But I think there's another reason we underestimate today's labor movement, and that is that we fail to think globally. All too often, Western researchers find declining union density in their own country or in a small subset of the world's 195 nations. Often the OECD data is used. And they generalize these trends to the world. But what is true for the richer post-industrial nations is not necessarily true for the rest of the world. Here I'm going to cite what I consider the Bible of global trade union statistics. And now we're just talking about trade unions, more narrowly defined. The Historical Dictionary of Organized Labor, 3rd edition, 2012, edited by Australian researcher James Docherty and his associate at the Amsterdam Institute for Social History, Jacques van der Velden. And he is on our program, and I think he's sitting right out there. According to their estimates, between 1970 and 2010, union ranks worldwide grew by some 77 million members. Well, how can this be? There's lots of explanations. including the rising numbers of waged workers worldwide, as documented by Ronaldo Monk and others. Unemployment may be rising, but so is employment as the shift to a cash-based waged world continues. But part of the story that Jacques and his associate tell is the growth of labor in Latin America, Asia, and Africa, a growth that offsets more than the declines in other places. They modestly conclude that the global growth of organized labor, and here I'm quoting, is one of the unsung success stories of modern world history, unquote. Now, of course, this one volume does not put the question of labor's global fall and rise, or rise and fall, to rest, but it does stand as one of the most reliable overviews we have. The last third of the volume is taken up with their explanation of the data they use and how it both underestimates and overestimates union membership. But I should add, the volume that I've just been talking about is not the only empirical study challenging the widely accepted collapse of labor trope. But let me move to the second part of my talk, and to what I think we should be doing more of and why. I've been arguing that our field is changing in many positive ways. It's broadened, it's growing. But let me ask about our theories. Has our conceptual apparatus caught up with our ambitious, expanded research agenda? Or are we suffering from a kind of theoretical lag? What have we learned from our new empirical undertakings? Do the new subjects we study necessitate a new framework of analysis and the invention of new paradigms? And if so, what should these be? I'm going to offer some suggestions. I'm really looking forward to opening up the conversation to you and also hearing your thoughts. In my view, our theory has not caught up with our expanded empirical reach, and labor history is the lesser for it. As a field, we are still mired in outmoded concepts and assumptions inherited from the 19th century. Our prevailing paradigms are industrial and economistic, based largely on the perceived desires, consciousness, and actions of an industrial, waged male proletariat. So let me turn to consider some alternative paradigms and to think about how we might construct theories that are more appropriate for the new labor history that we're writing. So let's start with class, the category of analysis often thought most central to labor history. As we know, in the university, in the academy, class is back, as is materialist analysis. I applaud the class turn and the rise of a more materialist history. Our histories, labor and otherwise, will benefit, I think, from more attention to material matters, to lived experience, to power, and to structures and forces. But in our haste to return to class, let's not forget why we left it in the first place. What we need is not just a return to class, but a reformulated concept of it, one useful for the broad field we're becoming. What might such a reformulated concept look like? Well, for one, it would recognize that our theories of class and of class experience should rest as much on the desires, consciousness, and actions of women as of men. In 2007, as Ragna mentioned, I pulled together an edited anthology called The Sex of Class because I was shocked at how so much of the writing on the working class was really about working class men. Or put another way, how resistant class analysis still was to gender and to sex differences. As it turned out, at least in the United States, the majority of the working class, and here I'm defining it using some of Michael Zweig's ways of thinking about class, defining it by power, authority, and income. The majority of the working class was female. And if we were to understand the history of work, of working class movements, or the dynamics of working class politics, I argued, we needed to include the majority in our analysis. Well, if the present-day conversation about working class politics is any indication, very little has changed. I think there's a singular lack of clarity about how to think about class, how to define it, an inability to imagine a working class world of diverse politics, and a stubborn refusal to include women in the working class. Based on little or no empirical data and an over-reliance on education as a proxy for class, a real problem, I think, analysts, at least in the US, prattle on about the angry, misogynist, racist, politically reactionary working class, and they treat all workers as a monolithic group. Workers are blamed for Trump's election, for example, and more broadly for the rise of the right everywhere. It's true, many workers, many American workers did vote for Trump, and that's a fact we need to understand. But actually, the majority did not. The exit poll data compiled by the New York Times is one of the few efforts to sort voters by income and over time is revealing. Of those making less than $50,000 a year, and that's roughly the bottom 40% of American earners, it's true, 16% more voted Republican in 2016 than did in 2012, and that's a remarkable shift to the right. Yet, and here's my point, what is rarely noted is that despite that shift, the majority of those making under $50,000, again, that's the bottom 40% of American earners, they pull the Democratic lever, just as they have since the 1930s. Furthermore, they were the only income group that voted Democratic. Those earning over $50,000 favored Trump. As political journalist Eric Sasson said in The New Republic, stop blaming the working classes for Trump's election. The middle class and wealthy came out in droves for him and made up the bulk of his support. So then why this stampede to blame workers and their reactionary political attitudes for the rise of the right? I think it says a lot about the resurgence of a new, yet just as mean, social Darwinism, one directed toward those at the bottom. The working classes, like the poor, are stereotyped and deemed lesser. They are thought brutish, incapable of reason, out of control, and often just plain dumb. But it also, I think, has to do about forgetting about working class women. They, it seems, are not part of the working class. Yet, as we know, the voting gap between men and women continues to grow in the US as well as across the Western world, prompting The Economist magazine to call women the lefter sex. And this gender voting gap exists up and down the class ladder. Yet working class women's politics, the politics of the majority of the working class, rarely make it into the analysis. This is where labor history and labor historians can make a difference. We've always talked about the working classes and the multiplicity of class experience over time and place. As E.P. Thompson insisted, class is a lived experience made and remade from the cultural and material fabric of our lives. Our task is to capture the historical particularities of class and class consciousness and of political subjectivities in all their varieties, and to remind theorists and pundits that workers come in all sizes and shapes, that there is no one working class consciousness or one working class politics, because there is no one worker. Yet our inherited class theory is problematic in other ways. As I've argued elsewhere, our theories of collective mobilization are deeply mired in the past and based on narratives about the formation of an industrial proletarian. Our inherited framework of collective mobilization assumes workers in large factories or factory-like settings will be more likely to organize collectively. Workers in scattered small shops who lack the classic waged relationship with an employer are thought less likely to act collectively. Yet we know otherwise. So many of the workers organizing today, domestic workers, home-based, freelancers, janitors, cleaners, day laborers, drivers and transport workers, street vendors and small producers, these are the very workers the theory predicts would be quiescent. Indeed, in some ways, we can talk about the rise of the lumpen or the petty bourgeoisie, not the proletarian. But whatever terms we use, our theories of collective mobilization need to be remade in light of who is remaking the world. There's much more to say about our inherited class theory and how it needs rethinking, and so I look forward to hearing from you and some of your ideas and thoughts about this. But given time constraints, I want to move on, and I want to offer some reflections on the limits of our economistic heritage and why labor history needs, in my view, more attention to emotions, both when we are thinking about individuals and when we are theorizing about social movements. It's what I call a whole person labor history. Many of the ways our economistic heritage, there are many ways in which our economistic heritage ill serves us, and these are well known. The question, for example, of how we define the economy and which work we judge as productive and value creating, that question must be tackled. limiting the economy to market work and positing goods production over service and care work as the primary drivers of value and productivity are all 19th century economic fictions we would do well to move beyond, as gender scholars have stressed for some time. And although there's often general nodding and agreement when it is claimed that market production and social reproduction are interconnected and inseparable, the new histories of capitalism that I've read pay scant attention to the household economy and to how capitalism would collapse without it. As political theorist Nancy Fraser reminds us, we still know very little about the history of social reproduction, the changes in work and work organization that occurred within households, and how changes in the household and in social reproduction interfaced with different stages of capitalist development. So those issues are important, but I think we need to do more than integrate social reproduction and the domestic into our theories of capitalism and the economy, again, as significant as those and that effort would be. Like C. Wright Mills, I think one of the greatest challenges of writing history is to understand how the biographical and the social interconnect, how the micro and the macro intertwine. Labor history, I think, has always been better at thinking about the social than the self. It's time now to correct that imbalance. We need a more intimate labor history, one more attentive to emotions and to the inner life of workers and their movements. And what theory will we draw on to write about the self? Are we to continue to embrace our inherited assumptions of rational man and of economic self-interest? Is our battered but still standing explanatory catch-all of false consciousness still useful? How do we explain the rise of rightist politics? What emotions should a left populist movement encourage? We now have a flourishing literature on the emotions from many disciplinary perspectives, including history. Sociologist Arlie Hochschild's concept of emotional labor is perhaps most familiar to labor historians, but there's also fascinating historical explorations of the emotional rules governing the expressive life of past generations. Here I'm thinking of the early work of Peter and Carol Stearns, as well as new studies of how individuals and social groups conformed to, channeled, and repudiated these norms. There's also an exploding field of politics and emotions, and the emotional cultures of movements. But labor history as a field, I think, has kept these subjects at arm's length. And I would like to ask us to reconsider that. Why? Why do I ask us to do this? Well, first, I think we do our subjects a disservice by not attending to them fully, by not, as Lucien Febvre said in an early essay in 1941, by not reconstituting their whole physical, intellectual, and moral universe. But second, our understandings of social movements, of why people join together and what they hope to gain, cannot rest solely on economistic explanations. As Arlie Hochschild claims in her new book on the Tea Party, called Strangers in Their Own Land, hey, luckily we're inside. This is good. I was just mentioning Arlie Hochschild's new book. It's 2016, Strangers in Their Own Land, Anger and Mourning on the American Right. She argues that people acted not just in their economic self-interest, but in their emotional self-interest. Certainly, bread matters, and economic security and freedom from want are basic human desires. But basic, too, is the desire for recognition, for social inclusion, for respect, for dignity. These goals were central to movements for civil rights, to women's movements, and to movements for sexual liberation. Yet they were central, too, to worker movements. Worker movements have a long history of battling for recognition of their whole person and the right of workers, like other classes, to political inclusion and social respect. But what motivates people to act collectively to achieve such goals? What emotions do social movements have? What emotions should they have? Anger is often the first emotion named as a prerequisite for revolt. It signals injury, a sense of injustice, a recognition that one's constraints are not of one's own making. Yet in her 2016 book, Anger and Forgiveness, philosopher Martha Nussbaum warns, and I think rightly so, against movements in which anger dominates all else. Anger, she argues, and the desire for payback must ultimately be left behind, replaced with a willingness to create a political program and a set of political institutions that can prevent future harm and secure the common good of the majority. We live in a world in which people feel injured, angry, humiliated, and fearful. And many feel this way even though they are not deprived materially. If we're to have a populism of the left, not of the right, we will need to figure out how to heal people's psychic wounds and how to make people feel less angry, less vengeful, less willing to dehumanize their enemy. We will need people and movements that are more empathetic, more forgiving, more concerned with designing the institutions of the future than getting the short-term satisfaction of hurting those they perceive have hurt them. Many social movements of the past knew this. They addressed psychic injuries and losses as well as material deprivations. Martin Luther King, Mahatma Gandhi, Nelson Mandela knew this. So too do many of today's new labor movements. The Self-Employed Women's Association, the new care worker movements, and many others. They are practicing a whole person unionism. It is attentive to the full range of human feeling and consciousness. I think it is up to us to write a whole person labor history. Thank you.